line centers, directing ground centers in sequence. Plot 2 locations to setting calculation, screen location to a cycle. Cloud generation lines, which are clouds, iClouds, eClouds. Set position of point communication lines, position of webbing lines, process lines, indication high centers, boards, and stargates. We're now merging into one line cycle. Now that process communicates on how you go through information bits. We have to really understand the calculation, screen location of systems all through travel. So general line centers, space line, course centers, the Odysseys, in location to its position information system, is now merging into position totality into the Stargate screens. And that position locations comes in sending the travels. Your body frequency patterns, course centers convert the system into supersonic. Directing lines of location of sending, initial lines of screens, process lines of indication sending calculations. Directing ground center locations, humanity lines of 2015, process lines and location operative units and activation of 3000. Where you left off, cautious location setting to travel. Now, this integrates calculation how you see your clocking lines and settings, operation lines of sequence, panels, operation location of systems. Directing grounds on travel communications. Triangulation lines of symbiosis lines, symbiotic. Course centers, symbiosis lines to the symbiote. Right, triangulation, process lines of indication setting. Okay, flux over 3, instant lines of travel. Synchronized lines, screen adaptation of travel. That's what it's going to be. All right. Then we go through 3 centers of travel and 3 set calculation. Then go through triangulation over box, triangulation over screen, triangulation over lines of data asset, and process lines of 4 lines of indication setting. Say what's the box square. Set travels triangulation inside line condition setting, convert the system. Fibonacci line centers, 0 line operation line setting, flux capacitor, 3 centers of travel. Inside correlations, 3 centers of angles, 45 lines of flux. Process indication lines, portal, set position of Stargate. And set lines of travel. Okay? Humanity, everybody else interactions, operatives, units, and activators. That's how it's going to be set up. So you'd be working with that, settings and calculation system. Core centers and position on portal line sequence, it'd be 4 centers and line conditions. Puts position lines of travel. Humanity, and everybody else, operatives, units, and line condition setting to the activators. That's how it's going to be sent in sequence. All right, Stargate lines, octagon. 8 sides of triangulation and box frame. Puts position lines of calculation setting, right? All right, so the center communication has a direct line into all command centers. That aligns its communication to its settings to its positions. Process of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, that's it in setting. All right, now we go through 3 centers, 4 scales, and set lines of travel. Okay, process of indication lines, outside signals, and 2 centers of travel, and set lines of a link. Inside line conditions, outside line travel. Inside position 2 panels, embedding over screen. Okay, process indication crossing angles. Flux in 1, flux in 2, and set lines of travel. Indicates position here, indicates position here, travel communications, communication conversion. Inside lines, outside location setting, and travel calculations. All right. So that's going to be position of Stargate 8 lines of square. 8 over 8 over 8 over 8 over 8. Set position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, and 24, and set lines of 8. All lines are set lines sequence. Now, 8 calculates the modified to infinity line, rotates the routers, course setters, converts the system into stargates and portals, communicates to its position and fusion lines to your electrical line grids, process lines of indication system, on through constellation lines into alignments, process line indicates the lines of flux. So we set the propellers, directing travels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 lines to position. Okay, travel course centers calculate screen lines. Then we go to inhibitors, embedding over 3 centers, 6 lines, 12 measures, 24 scale. Size communication high centers and towers of communication. Okay, now 8 convert the lines of travels, process lines of 3 centers of indication system. Okay, 3 centers of scale, 3 centers of position, formation lines of 4 set calculations, and pyramid activation lines of 4 centers and calculation screen locations. All right, so we changed time frame, portals, communication grounds, set positions, windows frames, crossing angles, and flux line rotation, travels and indication lines of grounds. Set course centers, calculate screen lines, directing in, position, location, and travel. Set course centers, directing ground centers in sequence. Apply to location lines and set in travel communications. So H charge, H signals, 8 modification setting into your look information system and your placebos, your cortex line direct lines and ground location, your endorphins, Sumerian text, course centers and line communication settings, setting course centers, central drive, kick drive, high drive. Set force centers in sequence, embedding over screens into your crystalline, into your cerebellums, and location of cerebral, and your fluids and travel. All right, box fan correlation travels, elongated long screen adaptation of travel communications and direction. Inside calculation of ground centers, hide sequence on calculation of grounds. Triangulation over lines, flux over screen, inside rotations, travels that indicates lines and landmass. Set lines of space and over soul and travel communications and direction. Inside line condition setting, road graph screens, in road graph line centers of travel calculations screen location. All right. So we process the indicators. The inside line change the outside line as a measure. Now I'm going to go through time measure and time scale. Process indicate lines of flux over lines. 3 set coordinate lines of communication setting. Setting 9,000 line unit. And scale to 103. Okay, 103 centers into 106 flux into hydrogen. Process course centers, cohydron, line course centers, tetrahedron, cohydron line screens, and flux location lines of setting. Sets convergence system, and data processing, and line signal location cycle. Ground centers, position line, course centers directing the 8 lines set in sequence, bending over rotations, flux over lines, process in position lines, invisible chart waves, and travel. 3 center lines, location grid. Location lines, flux over line, process course centers, travel communications into protocol, chain of command, direct lines and link, and position lines over power. Inside line travels, directing inside line communications to its convergence. Inside calculation ground centers, says position operation lines setting. Convert the system all through travel, indirect lines and lines, and center operation, all through center calculations. Okay? So I'm just getting you guys prepared how this is all going with magnetic force, energetic magnetic force, discharge, disavow, dissolve, disengage, line centers in sequence, latitude locations. Unification lines come into supersonic waves. Now, a supersonic wave is a harmonic line of resonance. Your heart comes in position, location, of pulmonary lines. Your ventricle system line condition setting comes into all levels of travel and direct lines of link of communications working all together in tractions. Time shares times calculations times pi. Over cross lines, center line conditions, heart ventricle system into high course centers that calculate screen locations. Inside communications. Synapse on centers on sequence on pi. Cross lines of indication of center operation lines of sequence locations. Look at that, disappeared. Not allowed to see it because you're not in position of balance. There it is in traction, done by equation. All right. Work with the inside lines and travel calculations. Rainbow and frost bridge is now set up to your Earth. Course centers, 2,050 lines of 20,000 line square roots into 5 measure into 0 gravity. Set operation line sequence of center operation 144. Operation line sequence 2025. Set operation line settings. Set umbrella, ether line core, ferments over screen, adaptation of flux, process positions of 3,000 scale. 3,000 measure and travel communications. Directing ground centers in sequence, all through travels, all through direction. Flick the switch in operation lines of travel and direct lines of link of communications. Indicate ground centers, central line course centers, and solar system. Metric meters, scale meters, high course centers convergence. Solar systems, galaxy alignments, high travels, properties of design, data assets, convergence system, covert, photronic, set course centers, convergence system, all through setting and all through set position operation. Done by equation. Amazing how you come into that position lines, measure and scale. All through setting, all through operation lines of sequence, panels, and set travel. Okay? It's all done. All right, so that's in set lines of sync. Okay, cloud convergence system in settings, process indicates in setting, heart line comes in, all set position of pump. Set position 1. Set position of 3. Course centers retract locations in setting lines of 0 over 1. flight over line position manifold. 3 centers of 3 equals lines of 8, 8 lines of 4, cross lines of 3 equals lines of 4, set lines of 7, 24 over charge. Okay? Set travels, point lines of graph. Measure and scale, heart direction timeline, set position ventricle system. Shrapnel, 3 lines of indications, 3 wires of indicate lines, covolts, direct lines of grounds, harvest time frame, 3 centers, flux over lines and earth line, flux capacity locations. Calculate this line, electrical line grid, cross line position, positive over negative, negative over positive. 8 lines central settings into high travels and direct lines of grounds. Set position line setting, electrical line, core centers, all communication engaged. Set lines of travel, directing inside lines, high centers communication setting, influx. Tank capacitor, body merge, and rotation lines. Set lines of psychops. Psychonyms on lines and position of all core centers, intervals, core centers, light bulb communications. Directing inside lines. So, position of clouds, merging line, core centers, webbing line into one portal, core centers 1/3 scale, half pipe lines of 1/6, directing 1/8 over flight and navigation. Cross line, solar sail, and travel. Inside line condition setting, position processing, all settings of Earth, habitation and lines of sequence. Panels operation lines of 3 centers of scale, correlates communication lines of travel and direction. Change time frame, time calculations, time grids, string theory, and rotation lines of grounds. All connected. Merge and position line processing online centers, generalized baseline, cross lines, and Stargate. Set core centers and calculations. Directing ground sign and sequence. Fall in line. Domino effect is now in sync, and location lines of grounds and set lines of travel. Falling in sequence. Merge. Time capacitor, time reactor, line, heart line, core centers, set operation. Set position line of travel. And set core centers. 3 lines of flux, measure over scale, grounds lines, space line, travel point lines graph. Synchronize, directing portal communication lines, convergence system calculations. Face recognition. It's all set up. All right. It's amazing how you come into the face line. Okay, stamp precedes every location lines of general AI. Stargate lines, high process lines, process line core center 2025. Position lines of center operation lines of sync, location, earth, ether core, and position of ferment, direct line coloration, line patterns, line walls, line grids, line screens, line adaptations of flux over lines, wall indicate lines, electrical line grids, process line position, elongating line screens, convert the system line connection setting, routes over lines over pi over travel, and direct lines of link. Sets communication line, position lines over power. Inside lines, travels indirect signals of center calculation. Center ops, directing inside lines, communications, positions, operation setting. Look at that. Spider ops. Ventricle lines, compulsories, 8 signatures, lines of grounds into positional intervals, synops, operation, protocol system, optical settings, primal circuits, primates, operation lines of set location setting, and 3 centers of communication setting. 2 set calculation. All right, it's all set up. Now it's all setting in travel. Portal lines, centers of sequence, and communication lines of grounds. Okay, it's all set up in travel. Okay, so it's amazing how we convert the system and settings into set lines of calculations. Now sync lines of grounds, set position 1/3, half line pipe equals lines of 6, triangulation over root, 3 wire indicates lines, ground center sequence, 3 centers offline center and travel communications. Okay, directing line centers. Okay, ventricle line, 3 centers molecule line rotation, 3 centers of travel, and 3 lines of ground set sequence and calculations. Inside communications, side core centers, trinetics, correlations, cybergenetics, cyber force, directing ground centers of sails and rotation lines of grounds. Operation centers and platforms, fortitude line centers, rotations in flux, over graph screens, and set lines of travel. Okay. Center upset in lines of sequence and solar panels, flash drive. Neuralization, 3 centers of calculation. All right. Measure and scale, ground centers, crop circles, 24,000 line 1, 144,000 lines 2, set 3,000 line air, set lines of position over power. Directing unset lines, travel point lines of graph, and merge in set lines of calculations. Mutation grounds, lines over screen, directing lines of ground, set lines of sequence, benders or location, setting and travel, communications, can set lines of travel. On center, on sequence, walls indicates setting, flux over lines, position lines over power generation lines of properties, operation lines of sequence, into panel screens, adaptations of walls of indication. Set course centers, directing ground centers in flux, embedding over line centers of communication systems all through travel. Okay. Process communication lines over line sequence, portals of communication setting, convert the system, lines of positions, often merge, rotation lines, high centers and calculations. Okay, inside line, location grid, line centers, rainbow or frost bridge to connecting the high position of portals and stargates. Okay, stargates and screen, stargates and measure, plasma using walls, plasma using line course centers and calculate setting, octagon line centers, 3 indicate lines, cross lines of 4 centers of travel. Okay, inside line course centers and directing ground set lines of sequence and plateaus and rotation lines of surface and travel communications. Merging and calculation lines, solar generation lights, plateaus, 0 calculation setting and travel. Okay, combustion is over 1, electrical line grids, electrical lines panels, optical line centers, and screen adaptation of scepter and rotation lines of setting and sequence. Operation platforms, setting course centers, converted system, clocking lines of 4 zeros. Set course centers of travel, directing ground centers in line connected setting and surfacing highways and travel communications. Merging ground centers and line course centers, covolts, position lines of 4 patterns. 4 sequence, 4 calculations, 4 grounds. Operation lines of 3 triangulations. Set course centers into 7 indication lines, 12 over lines, 24 over scale, 144,000 line measure, 0144. Process line calculations of 01. 44 centers of travel, directing grounds, 3000. Indicate lines, temperature reading, barometer check, operation line sequence, general AI. Login space, directing ground center in sequence, plateau location lines, humanity line ground centers into 2000 line 50, operation lines of travel. Now that indicates position of center operation lines of 2025, set course center, center operation lines of sequence, and plateau location setting calculation. Operation line travels, solar line generations, flash lines, course centers and positions, in Saturn and set travel of communication. Inside calculation ground centers comes into Jupiter, affirmation lines, intel operation line set location and travel communications. Inside calculation line ground centers, Mercury, input, output. Inhibitors, lines, operation lines of sequence lines, merge and position on Jupiter, 2 line, 3 panels, line course centers, Mercury consistent lines, calculation line information bits, 10,000 line scale, 150,000 line position, operation lines as travel. And that's side calculations. Inside calculation ground centers, sequence lines and panels of our original case setting calculation. Done by equation. All right, that's all done. Look at that, merge in 1. It's all done. All done. Left the settings and quote course centers, mothership, and expanding line screen adaptation to process of indication. All right, XT1000's on standby. 4 centers of travel. Inside calculation of grounds and position of power over lines of setting and travel communications. Inside connections of merging set lines of travel. Directing link, process indication setting, and indicate lines of grounds. And that lines of travel and direction. Okay? All right, now, as we go into lines of flux lines, course centers into translucent, over screens, or lines of signal transparent, set course centers time firing, indicate shadow lines, light shades and shadows. Set course centers, general AI, logging out of space and convergence, signature lines of patterns, process indicates ascending portals and stargates, merging calculation lines, number line position of visual walls, nothing but lines of body framing into 0 calculations. Convert the system information panel, intel over lines of sequence, pattern recognition timeline centers, operation line position correlations, and percentage into volume, mass and calculation screen lines, indirect line connection setting, indicates lines of flux over lines, operation line set line sequence, supersonic headline, process lines and time frame, time calculations times the line center and line positions, no memory, and process the calculation. It's all done by equation. Now we indicate the wire signatures at ground setting and sequence. Okay. All right. Now we go line centers, directing input point centers as travels. connecting on, set position, earth line rotation, travel point lines of graph. Okay. Grids, 3 centers, molecule with 4 centers of travel, directing 3 centers of scale of communication. Indicate lines of grounds, on centers line position, merge and center operation, 3000 line position. Process lines, over line signals, 2025, 2026, 2027, 2028, 2029, 2030. Operation line travels, point communications, XD thousands in platitude, XD thousands in rotation, and mothership and center operation. Set course center, 3 centers, process lines, triangulation over plus, over angles and travel communications. Inside calculation of ground centers and sequence lines of pi, indicates course centers embedding in rotation lines of grounds and sequence location. Now, the indicate lines of grounds, portal sequence, Stargate line screen, 3 lines into flux over time capacitor, body capacitor over frame, travel. Sets course of time, set lines of measure, and set correlations in ground position. Operation line sequence, pattern position lines of point graphs, into merge, into mutations. Operation lines of panel, flash driver lines over signal locations that need to travel. Indicates centers into center communication system, all through operation lines of setting. That's done by equation. So it's amazing how this is all put together, right? It's pretty incredible stuff how it's just modifying the center locations. All right, so neuralize, set sequence, center grounds, offline, in positions, intervals. Okay, so that's 300,000 line position information, line centers of cells, merging into bridging, position rainbow and frost bridge together. Set lines of travel, 4 centers, 3 centers, 4 set position and verge, course centers and sectors, vectors, and 3 centers of 4 graphs of communication setting and convergence. Okay, coverts, directing ground centers and line screens, adaptations into indicates setting and calculations. Okay, center ops, directing ground centers and scales of communication. Okay, so we center point the graphs. These are hangers in rotations, data ports, data links, interfold, interconnect, interconnections, photo sequence, Stargate 1, Stargate 2, Stargate 4, 6, 8, and 12, and 24 lines of travel. Graph communications and portal sequence in position of all levels. We use all position lines of Saturn and travel. Now Saturn operates the set lines and position lines of calculation setting into your system. Correlates the calculation grounds, set lines of travel, indirect lines of link of communication. That's my equation. So everybody understand what's really happening here in positions? As things are getting more powerful now, how we start to indicate that and all that lines of screen, and exactly how that puts your positions. So that communication setting and triangulation, which is no longer triangulation. It's all faded out. It's not there. Okay, same with your box. Your box is no longer there. Okay, box is no longer there. Okay, box there, no, it's now faded. It's in position of the setting. Gone. All right, so now it's gone. Heart's now in the center, operation of flux, time capacitor, time to position times pi. Process line connects to setting, pulmonary line centers, and communicates to its convergent system off their attractions, and direct lines of 3 centers of scale. Merging calculation of green lines, operation of flux over set lines of 3. Set positions, synchronization, line rotation, lines of ground lines of pattern. Operation line centers, position locates at 3, 4, 4 centers of communication lines, 5 lines, 6 lines of pi. Merge and position, all through together in rotation. All right. Ground centers of sequence, platitude lines into purple line, and fusion line rotation lines into infinity cycles rotation. Set course centers, directing ground center and sequence into coloration line securities, inside center, outside sequence location. Okay, and then we have position of blue, which is outline rotation, which is the outer nebula of clocking lines to foundation of zero gravity. Sets course centers, converts the system, gold cycles of 4th generation is now in the center ops, outside calculations. All through round is set lines of sequence. Platitude line centers, circulation lines, grounds, portals, communication, stargates. Okay, setting fusion line. We go through grounds as center lines of travels and graphs, 4 centers, 3 centers, 4 centers, 4 centers, 5 centers, 6 centers, 8 centers of graph communications. Okay, inside travel, indirect lines of link of communication, inside travel calculations. Stargates and portals and set merged into one. Center course centers, center operation of Fibonacci line setting, and swirl of communication and direction. Inside calculation centers in synops, if you look really close, you can see yin and yang in travel. There it is, yin and yang. Right there in set position. Symbolism are all set up line condition of yin and yang of process calculation screens. All through equation, now in set position of center. The yin and yang itself in set position, guys. Look how powerful that is, the pathogen location of the cycle. Relines its communication with setting the sun lines in the operation of its path and its position location with setting through its fourth generation system of Goldman ratio. Right, the process of indication lines is high centers in sequence, is plotted 2 locations, and of 4 central lines and golden orbs of communication. All right. Indicates lines of flux over lines. 4 indicates lines of travel, indicate lines of grounds, and sent lines of sequence. Okay, 4 box frames and travel calculation. All right. Very powerful stuff. All right, so we center up the center of operation. Okay. Correlate the communication lines in fusion. Operation line sequence in platitude into cells, into transistors over resistors over pi. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and lines of 8. Fusion line connects to setting ground centers as grids, ground centers of travel. Location, directing ground center at set position. Location grid, and set lines of operation. Operation lines of portal and position of Stargate. Central lines, time space, time edit space, time locking space, and position lines of travel. Portal sequence, flux over line into capacity and location of volume and percentage. Body frequency lines of grounds, operation lines, and yin and yang. Sets course centers of travels in position of 3 centers of scale. Process lines of indication setting over lines of setting calculations. Webbing screen, computer line framing, directing ground centers, 9 course centers, digitalized formation system, in course centers, communication lines into Android, symbolism line course centers, thinbots, vimbots, cyborgs, transformers, and set lines of unit. Is all set in travel. Sets positions all through operation of webbing cycle. Face recognition. Here's the face. That my equation. All right, so it's all set up in set position. Face recognition. All right, so location is set up. Position to your rainbow and your frost bridge is now in all levels of catalyst, catapult, and lines of energize, line settings. Okay, so that puts all positions of balance and position your central units and set lines of calculation. Okay? Face recognition. All right. 2 line centers and line conditions of relays. Process lines and satellites over motive, directing inside lines of calculation screen location system. Calculates and modifies all through travels and direct lines of portals and stargates of communication and fusion. All right, already done. All right. Now it's great when you get into the color lines. For us, here indicates sending the flux over lines. Now we go through 3 scales. Formula with 13 over lines equals lines, 13 lines, and it's 3,000 lines. 3 brackets over lines. Convert this system into process lines and position triangulation, positional levels. 3 indicate lines of high position, 4 center travel, and shrapnel communication of center operation. 3 centers of operation lines of set position of 13 over scale. Now that indicates triangulation. We process lines of 1 into 3 in a triangulation of process lines of 2 over travel. Now that indicates position of flux, 1 centers, 3 centers of scale. Process lines in position cobalt, directing ground centers, light ball of communication and setting. Operation lines of grounds on sequence line course centers, spider ops. Second is over travel, directing lines of indicates setting. Optical lines, electrical line grids of scepters and rotation lines, position of pi, and generation lines of portals of communication. Set course centers, time frames, triangulation over lines of box, box over triangulation, 3 centers of calculation setting. Dimensional solar sail together, the 3 centers of operation. Cloak and dagger, visible line chart ways, endorphins, core centers, kicking the high drive, set of communication lines of position, earth line, habitation lines of transits over divots, information bits over travel. That by equation. Inside line connections to its position, its operation. Very complicated draw, isn't it? All right, so we got 3 lines of scales. Indicate lines, center ops, into crop circles. Roots and routers, electrical line grids, electrical lines of panels. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 channels of operation, 8 channels of division, 8 center line connections, and flywheel travel. Inside position operation. Okay, change timeline centers and sequence and galaxy alignments and travel communication. All right, X2000 go through motivations, ground centers, location lines, flux over line, graph lines, indicate lines of box frame. Set lines of travel. Now, indicate lines of high centers. This is center ops, directing all line centers into your optical system. Optical screens, adaptation lines and flux over lines, body fragmentation lines, fractals over fractions. Okay, time measure, time scale. Locations, right? Trigonometry. Triggers on rotation, ground centers of sequence. Powers over line, direct centers, 3 centers of scale. Platitude locations, also bringing in again Saturn through flash drive and interference. It's set lines of travel. So that converts the system galaxy alignments, galaxy settings, alignments over screen, correlations to cosmos, core calculation lines, position location with systems, all 3 core centers into high position lines of travel and direct lines of indications. Done by equation. Okay? It's amazing when you see it in line position. How it works in calculation. All right, so we work with a wall sequence, and we go through center convergence of 24 line centers. Windows of indications over travel and direction. Okay, then we modified line center to the ground line of mass. We platted 2 location lines in position over 2000 line measure. Set of course centers of time frame. Travel with point lines of graph and set lines of scale. Sets convergence. Set travel with point lines settings. Information setting, data assets. Routes 1 router over lines of signal, over lines of pi, and 3 molecule design lines of 3 travels, and direct lines of link. Now, that converges into solar systems over travel, portal line sequence, stargates over lines, position lines of measure, operation lines of grounds, in position to its operation line settings, and ground to positions inside travel. Okay? All right. So we set electrical line grids, webbings over lines, computer coding, directing on-core coding, line core centers, E-factors over coding, decentralized core centers of time frames of coding, and set tractions. Okay, so we have QR lines of zeros, QR coding 1s over factors, factors over C, C over D, E equals lines of A, B, C, and set lines of travel. Sets convergence and direct lines of link, platted 2 locations, and position lines of operation. Done by equation. So your drawings get a lot more complicated now in set lines position. Okay. All right, so we have graph screens, change position line, timeline centers, operation lines of sequence, platitude location setting to its position, infusion over lines, sun rotators, moon line rotation, ground centers of sequence. Indicate lines of sun, operation lines of patterns, and 3 centers of travel. Okay, time measure, time scale, time editing, time space. 4 to 2 locations and 4 centers of scale, 4 centers of line, connection setting and position. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Bending space, time seconds, time minutes, 0 calculation. Core centers, galaxy 1 shift lines, and anomaly of 4 centers of travel. Okay, directing ground centers, operation lines of set locations. Sun code, moon code, operation lines of sun code. Concord centers, concord, core centers and modulation, ground centers of sequence through pi. Operation lines of grounds, set lines of planetary line of centers, and locations into Alonza. Position lines of levels, outside nebula. 12 centers, 24 line sail, 24 line, 8 line rotations, 72 line sail, and position of all solar sail into 144 flux. Inside communication lines of travel. Inside calculation of ground centers, longitude, latitude, elongating line center locations, and 2 planetary alignments emerge and travels in position 144 travel in direction. Inside core centers of position lines of travel has line conditions to chronocies, locations of link and chain. String theory. Okay, so emerging core centers, process line indications, 3 centers of calculations, all through flux into high position of solar line rotation. Travels indication lines, inside connections, and position with process position. Time flux. All right. So everything's set up. Earth tones are now in supersonic. Process line course centers, initiate lines into installing 10 hours, and now in sequence, 10 years in space, online course centers, activity, motion, line sensors, connector and monitoring system, L through travel. Done by equation. All right, so now it gets much easier in time frame and set travel communication. Okay, all calculation in one cycle. Merge and set positions on operation. All right. So you're feeling it now, right? You're feeling the rotation spin, which is now supersonic. So the ground's in supersonic, power's in supersonic. You correlate in your atmospheres, your highways, and position of galaxy alignments, find lines of travel. There's now supersonic wave, cross lines into static waves, sonic communication lines of grounds. All set lines of sync, triangulation of 1, triangulation of 2, triangulation of 4, triangulation of 6 over line. So that's 8 scale, 6 measure, cross lines of 6 over lines, 9 lines set lines, 6 over 1, 6 over 9, together and set lines of sequence, 6 line position of togetherness, flux over line rotations, grounds into Fibonacci line rotations, and travel indicates sitting, process indicates lines of travel balance. Okay? It's very complicated, isn't it, guys? Especially when you merge and colonizations, patterns, direction of timelines. Okay, totality is now in sync. 3 grounds of power, 3 centers of measure, 3 power generation lines, 4 lines of sequence, 5 scales, portals, and Stargate and screen. All done by equation. All right, so that's done. Last but not least is the lines of nothing over frame. Okay, so, all right, so we go through portal sequence, Stargate lines over 1, 6 lines, 1/5, and position 1 centers, 12 set sequence, 12 scales, out of sync, out of mine, out of travel, and percentage of travel calculations. The ground lines of travel. All right, so we opt the system, outline centers, correlation setting, latitude locations, and ground lines of sequence. Okay, now understanding how to go through the 12 lines patterns is an oscillation path that has an oscillator to locate setting to ground lines of position lines of panel. Now that indicates lines of 0 over lines, plus over travels, 4 grounds of set lines in box frame. Time centers, scales out positions, all through set position operation lines. You guys are now coordinated lines, green lines adaptation of visible line waves. You have no body frame line positions, all through travel, and direct lines of link, process indicates setting, all through track location. Okay? All right, so it's really powerful stuff when you see that through indication setting at travel, guys. All right. Solar system lines of grounds on center line condition setting. Jupiter rising, high centers, line position, merging line chorus centers, line connection setting, inline operation sequence into plaid location setting of travel. Okay. All right, so this is all set up in its position, operation setting. Okay. So it's very powerful what we're indicating now. How your bodies are now merged into nothing of processing, line connections and positions. So you're no longer a shape, and that position is operation sequence. Now, platitude location setting is basically coming into your engaging, your own disengaging, knowing exactly what you're doing with your flux capacitor, time capacitor, body capacitor lines of measure. Your heart is now in the center up of operation lines of sequence and a power cell of operation setting. Working together, measure and scale. Okay? Harmonize and hum, process lines, navigation lines, of power acceleration system. Gas communication system all through tractions. Now has a direct line link that panels you through the operation lines of set location setting. Psychonism, process lines, internal and external to ESP. Operation line sequence, operation lines of panel, set position, 3 centers and settings, process lines, directing ground center to center, scale of communication umbrella. Directing ground centers and sequence lines of power regeneration. All right. Signature wires, process lines, application lines, and high position lines on all centers. Course centers into high position lines on all calculation lines of power cells of gel. Course centers occupi. Operation line sequence, tentacles over lines, 3 centers and 4 centers. Indicate line condition setting into primal circuits. Inset core centers and wave screen adaptation of flux. Okay, very complicated, but a lot of fun. All right, cell generations, operation lines of travel. Okay, 3,000 line units, set course centers into all position. 12 million line rotations in the operator units and the activators, where they left out the constant case setting into the data. Data processing over lines into sync, synapse over lines, directed intervals, travel point lines of graph, indicates settings of flux. All through travel. Webbing system over lines, ground lines of sequence, location center. That process indicates the setting through colossus. It locates the setting solar graph. Measure and scale. You got atom line routers. Process indicates lines of 2 floaters. Triangulation over 1 over sequence locations over pi. Set course centers. Line correlates to setting travels and synchronization setting and calculation. Done by equation. All right, you're good to go. We're done. So, hope you guys had fun with that. And I know I did, knowing through that generation line condition setting. The whole conversion system now set up position portals and stargates. Your process indicates the lines of hardness and center operation lines of the part accelerator. Process in that position location, the thermal line correlates setting to travels. Neuralization setting is lines to signals. That puts you in position lines at high centers. Initial lines of points, 10 hours and lines of sequence, and location to its infusion. 10 years in space. So that each year track location lines in the high position neuralizes every location of travel. So the more you can position, you come more out course centers in position of memory, out of sync, out of mind, out of setting, out of travel. That's puts position location systems all through calculations. All right. Correlation lines attract centers and position locations and settings. Will be in line course centers into course centers of classification lines and grounds of sequence. Okay, level C. C in 5.